The Day They Bombed America, the true story of the Battle of Blair Mountain and the American Miners' Rebellion. The year is 1921. You believe you know American history, the Civil War, the Wild West, the World Wars. But there is one war fought on American soil by American citizens, with more troops than the Battle of Gettysburg and with bombs dropped from private planes, that has been erased from the textbooks. It is the story of a battle for the very soul of the working man, a desperate march of 10,000 armed miners against the overwhelming power of the coal operators. This is the true story of the West Virginia Coal Wars, a fight so brutal, so revolutionary, that the U.S. government sent in the Army to stop it. Part 1. The Kingdom of King Coal. The shackles of the company town. To understand the Battle of Blair Mountain, you must first understand the ground from which it sprang, the company town. By the early 1900s, in the hollows and hills of southern West Virginia, the coal seams ran deep and black, and so did the control of the operators who owned them. Towns like Matewan, Sharon, and Cabin Creek weren't just places to live, they were wholly owned subsidiaries of the coal companies. The superintendent of the mine was also the mayor, the postmaster, and the justice of the peace. The houses the miners lived in belonged to the company. The company store, the Pluck Me store, as the miners bitterly called it, was the only place to buy groceries, clothing, and tools. Wages were often paid not in U.S. currency, but in scrip, metal tokens or paper coupons redeemable only at the company store. This system guaranteed that a miner, no matter how hard he worked, was perpetually indebted. He was born in a company house, raised on company food, paid in company money, and buried in a company plot. Freedom was a myth. The work itself was a death sentence on an installment plan. The mines were dark, gas-filled, and utterly unregulated. Cave-ins, explosions, and the silent killer of black lung were daily realities. A man lucky enough to avoid a sudden, violent death might live to 50, coughing up his lungs. And should he die, his wife and children were instantly evicted from their company home. The miners' only hope was the United Miner Workers of America, the UMWA. But the coal operators, masters of their domain, saw the Union as a declaration of war. They would not tolerate it. Their defense against the UMWA was absolute, and their primary weapon was the Mine Guard, or more famously, the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. The reign of the Baldwin-Felts. The Baldwin-Felts men were not peacekeepers. They were a private army of mercenaries, hired guns employed by the coal operators to enforce a draconian rule. They were granted full police power in the company towns, operating above the law and beyond the reach of county sheriffs, most of whom were already bought and paid for by the coal companies. Their job was simple: keep the mines non-union at any cost. Their methods were brutal. They specialized in intimidation, beating, and outright murder. Their most common tactic for keeping a town clean of union talk was the blacklisting and immediate eviction of any miner suspected of joining the UMWA. Baldwin-Felts agents would descend on a worker's home, throw his family and all their meager belongings into the street, and forbid the man from finding work in any other non-union mine in the state. Starvation was their enforcer. This state of affairs boiled over in the early months of 1920 in the small, fiercely independent town of Matewan, a place where the local government had managed to retain a sliver of independence from King Coal. Part 2. The Matewan Massacre. Sid Hatfield, the People's Sheriff. In Matewan, there was a rare and vital counterforce to the coal operators: Sid Hatfield, the chief of police. Young, quick-tempered, and charismatic, Hatfield was the one lawman in the valley who refused to be bought. He openly sided with the miners, not because he was a Union man, but because he believed in the rule of law and the fundamental rights of his neighbors. On May 19th, the simmering tension exploded. A dozen Baldwin Felts agents, led by the notorious Albert and Lee Felts themselves, arrived in Matewan with a warrant to evict over a dozen striking miners and their families. They were methodical and cruel, tossing possessions into the muddy streets. As the agents prepared to leave, a crowd of angry miners gathered. Chief Hatfield confronted the Baldwin Felts men on the steps of the Matewan Depot. A tense standoff ensued over the legality of the eviction and the agents' right to carry their weapons inside city limits. The spark of war. The details of who fired the first shot are still debated, but the outcome is chillingly clear. In a sudden, furious burst of gunfire, the Matewan Depot turned into a killing field. Albert Felts was shot point-blank by an unknown hand and fell dead on the street. Lee Felts, his brother, was gunned down a moment later. In total, 7 Baldwin Felts agents were killed, along with 2 miners and the town's elderly mayor, C.C. Testerman, who had rushed to the scene. The Matewan Massacre, or the Battle of Matewan, as the miners called it, was a seismic event. It wasn't just a deadly shootout. It was the first time that the miners, led by a sympathetic local official, had successfully fought back against the private army of the operators and won. Sid Hatfield became an instant folk hero, the avenging angel of the mountains. But he was a marked man. The coal operators, humiliated and enraged, demanded vengeance. Hatfield and his deputy, Ed Chambers, were arrested and charged with murder, though they were later acquitted by a jury of sympathetic locals. Their reprieve was short-lived. In August 1921, Hatfield and Chambers were ambushed by Baldwin Felts agents on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch, West Virginia. The agents, armed with rifles, gunned down both men in cold blood while they were on their way to a separate trial, an act of sheer lawlessness that went unpunished. The assassination of their hero was the last straw for the miners. The time for law and order had passed. The time for a revolution had begun.
Part 3. The March on Logan. The Redneck Army gathers. News of Sid Hatfield's murder spread through the mining camps like wildfire, transforming anger into an unquenchable thirst for justice. Thousands of miners, mostly union men, but also many non-unionized workers who had simply had enough of the company's tyranny, began to gather. They came from all over the southern coal fields, emerging from the dark hollows with their squirrel rifles, shotguns, and any weapons they could scavenge. This was not an organized army. It was a spontaneous, desperate uprising. The miners tied red bandanas around their necks to distinguish themselves from the mine guards, a simple act that gave rise to the enduring and often derogatory American term redneck, meaning a rebellious and defiant member of the working class. Their goal was Logan County and its notorious sheriff, Don Chafin. Chafin was King Coal's most loyal and brutal servant, personally bankrolled by the coal operators to keep Logan County absolutely union-free. The miners knew that if they could organize Logan, they could finally break the company town system and secure their rights. By late August 1921, between 10,000 and 15,000 armed miners were marching south, forming the largest armed rebellion in U.S. labor history. It was a force larger than the American Army at many engagements of the Mexican-American War. They were a torrent of working-class rage heading toward the Logan County border. Don Chafin's defenses. Sheriff Don Chafin, a lawman with a private income rumored to be over $1 million, an astronomical sum for the era, did not wait idly.
He immediately began fortifying the hills of Logan County, particularly the imposing ridge of Blair Mountain, a key geographical barrier. Chafin rallied his forces. Local deputies, many were little more than company thugs on the payroll. State police, the West Virginia State Police, often called the thugs by the miners, who had a long history of siding with the operators. Mine guards and Baldwin Felts men, the private army, eager for a final decisive confrontation. Chafin established a fortified line along the ridge of Blair Mountain, digging trenches and building machine gun nests. The defenders, numbering about 3,000, were better equipped and positioned, holding the high ground. But the miners had overwhelming numbers and a righteous fury. Part 4. The Battle of Blair Mountain. The Days of Fire. The confrontation began on August 31, 1921. The miners, organized into loose companies, attempted to breach the line on Blair Mountain. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, lasting for 5 brutal days. The terrain was unforgiving, steep, forested slopes where every advance meant risking a bullet from an unseen sniper. The sounds of battle, rifle fire, the rat-a-tat of machine guns, and the yells of men echoed across the hollows of Boone and Logan counties. But the most terrifying element of Chafin's defense was his use of air power. The coal operators had hired local airmen, including World War I veterans, to fly over the lines and drop improvised bombs, ranging from small pipe bombs and containers filled with nails to leftover military ordnance, onto the marching miners. This was the only time in U.S. history that American citizens were bombed by private aircraft on American soil. Though often inaccurate, the bombings had a devastating psychological effect, shattering the miners' morale. The federal intervention. The national press covered the unfolding crisis with shock, labeling it a full-scale insurrection. Governor Ephraim Morgan, unable or unwilling to control the escalating violence, appealed directly to President Warren Harding. President Harding, facing a crisis of this magnitude, took decisive action. He issued 2 proclamations demanding the miners disperse. When they refused, he dispatched over 2,000 federal troops, including infantry, cavalry, and a flight of bombers under the command of Brigadier General H. Bandholtz. The arrival of the federal army changed everything. The miners, revolutionary as they were not fighting against the U.S. government. They were fighting for their rights as Americans. Union leaders, including the prominent Mother Jones, who had spent years organizing in the coal fields, desperately urged the men to surrender rather than fight the United States Army. On September 2, 1921, after 5 days of intense fighting and with the federal troops moving into position, the leadership of the miners' army reluctantly ordered the men to lay down their arms. The Battle of Blair Mountain was over. The casualty count remains uncertain to this day, as both sides minimized their losses, but estimates range from 50 to 100 people killed. Hundreds more were wounded. Thousands of men who had marched for freedom now simply walked home, exhausted and defeated, to face the inevitable reckoning. Part 5. The Aftermath and Legacy. The Trial and the Silence. The victory belonged to King Coal. While Sheriff Chafin and the coal operators faced no charges, hundreds of miners were arrested, indicted for murder, conspiracy, and treason against the state of West Virginia. The largest trials, held in 1922 and 1923, saw many miners convicted, their lives shattered, and the Union movement crippled for a generation. The Battle of Blair Mountain became a moment of official amnesia. It was a history the operators wanted erased, and one the miners were too broken to tell. For decades, the story was relegated to local legend, a terrifying, whispered memory in the Appalachian hollows. The sheer scale of the event, the largest armed rebellion in U.S. history since the Civil War, was buried beneath a mountain of indifference. But the miners did not march in vain. Their sacrifice, the massive negative publicity, and the lingering threat of future uprisings slowly began to turn the tide. In the 1930s, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, legislation finally protected the rights of workers to organize. The UMWA returned to the West Virginia coalfields, this time successfully organizing the miners and dismantling the brutal company town system forever. The battlefield itself, Blair Mountain, remained under threat. In the 21st century, local activists, the descendants of the very miners who marched, had to wage a new war in the courts to protect the mountain from destruction by mountaintop removal mining. Their efforts to preserve the site of the war, with its trenches, shell casings, and relics, continue to this day, a physical testament to a fight for freedom that defined what it truly meant to be an American worker. The story of Blair Mountain is a testament to the fact that the fight for American democracy was not just fought in legislative halls or on foreign battlefields, but in the dark, blood-soaked hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. It is a true American epic of courage, rebellion, and a desperate search for justice that should never be forgotten.